I have sold roasted chestnuts on the square outside the Silverstrand Gate for 31 years, and in all that time, I have learned exactly two things worth knowing. The first is that a cold morning sells more paper cones than a warm one. The second is that the mounted guard at the gate does not move for anyone, and that the men and women who come to test this fact are always, without exception, the sort of people who have never in their lives been told no. So when the tall man in the pale linen jacket began shouting at the horse, I set down my scoop, wiped my hands on my apron, and prepared to watch a lesson be taught. I did not yet know how good a lesson it would be. None of us did. Let me set the scene the way it was, because the newspapers got it wrong afterward, and the little clips that flew around the world got it worse. There is a difference between what a phone captures in 9 seconds and what a man who was standing 40 feet away for the whole of it remembers. I will give you the whole of it. It was the tail end of the tourist season, one of those bright, brisk mornings when the sky over the Capitol is the hard, clean blue of a washed plate, and the wind comes down off the river with a bite in it. The forecourt of the palace was full. It is always full at that hour. The changing of the mounted watch draws a crowd the way honey draws wasps, and the wasps come with their phones held up over their heads, filming a thing they will never watch again. Behind the black and gold railings, on the raked gravel, the household mounted escort had taken up their posts an hour before, and among them, at the near corner where the railing turns toward the gate, sat Sergeant Haldon Vane on his gray mare. You would know the mare if you saw her. Everyone in the district knew Bramble. She was a big-boned gray with a dark mane and one white sock on her off hind leg, and she had stood that corner post for 9 years, which in a cavalry horse is a long and honorable career. She had the temperament they breed and train for over years and years. The temperament that lets a half-ton animal stand stone still while a brass band marches past her nose and 1,000 strangers wave and shriek, and a toddler drops an ice cream against her foreleg. She did not spook. She did not fidget. She flicked an ear now and then, and her tail would swing at a fly, and otherwise she was as still as the man on her back, and the man on her back was as still as the stone lions on the gateposts. Sergeant Vane I knew a little better, because I had sold him chestnuts on his off days for years, and because a man learns the faces that pass his stall. He was perhaps 45, broad through the shoulder, with a weathered, watchful face and the kind of quiet that is not shyness but discipline worn so long it becomes the shape of a person. In his plumed helmet and his dark tunic with the silver braid, his gauntlets white as chalk and his boots polished to black glass, his saber in its scabbard and the reins loose and correct in his gloved hands, he did not look like a man. He looked like a monument someone had propped a horse under. That was the point of him. That is the whole point of the mounted guard, to be a thing that does not flinch, so that the people who live behind those gates may be reminded, and so that the people who come to gawk at those gates may be reminded, that some things in this restless world simply hold. The tall man in the linen jacket had been circling the crowd for a quarter of an hour before he found his target. I had noticed him, you noticed the loud ones, because he had a way of moving through people as though they were furniture. He was well dressed in that expensive, careless way, the linen jacket and the pale trousers, and the sunglasses pushed up into hair that had been cut by someone who charged a great deal for it. He carried himself like a man who was accustomed to a certain amount of the world arranging itself around his comfort. He had 2 companions with him, a younger man and a woman, both of them holding phones, both of them wearing the strained, embarrassed patience of people who travel with someone loud and have stopped being able to slow him down. He came to the railing near Bramble's post and he began, at first, the way they all begin. He wanted a photograph. He wanted the horse to look at him. He waved his hand in front of the mare's face and made a clicking noise with his tongue and said something to her in a bright, coaxing tone, the way you might speak to a dog you expected to be charmed by you. Bramble did what Bramble always did. She looked through him. Her dark eye stayed level and calm, fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the man, and her ears stayed forward, and she did not move. This is the moment, I have found, that separates people into two kinds. Most, when they meet that great serene indifference, laugh and step back and take their photograph and go away pleased. The animal's calm is a gift to them. They feel for a moment in the presence of something dignified, and they are content to have brushed against it. But there is another kind, a smaller kind, who cannot bear to be looked through. The stillness offends them. They read it as a challenge, or worse, as contempt, and something small and hot in them decides that this creature, this horse, this soldier, this monument must be made to acknowledge them, must be made to react, must be made to break. The tall man was the second kind. I saw the shift in him. I have watched it 100 times from behind my chestnut stall, and I could have told you the whole of what was coming from the set of his shoulders. "Hey," he said, louder now, and he rapped his knuckles against the top rail of the railing, a hard metallic clang that carried across the forecourt. "Hey, I'm talking to you." He was speaking to the horse. He said it again, and he leaned in over the rail and waved both hands wide at the level of the mare's eyes. "Come on, look at me, look at me." Bramble did not look at him. Sergeant Vane did not look at him either. The sergeant sat with his eyes forward and his back straight and his gloved hands quiet on the reins. And if he heard the man at all, and of course he heard him, they hear everything, they simply do not answer. He gave no more sign of it than the stone lions gave. This, naturally, made it worse. It always makes it worse. "Unbelievable," the tall man announced to his companions, to the crowd, to the bright cold air. "You see this? They train them to just nothing. It's like a statue. It's not even a real animal, it's—" and he laughed, a sharp, unpleasant laugh, and turned to the younger man beside him. "Are you getting this? Film it. Film the whole thing. This is going to be hilarious." The younger man lifted his phone with visible reluctance. The woman said something low, a hand on the tall man's sleeve. I could not hear it, but I knew the shape of it, the pleading, placating shape of asterisk. "Let's just go. Come on. Please asterisk." And he shook her off without looking at her. And I want to stop here before it goes further and tell you what the crowd was doing, because the crowd is a character in this story and I will not leave it out. At first the crowd loved him. That is the ugly truth of it, and I will not pretend otherwise. There is a kind of person in every crowd who is delighted when someone else does the rude thing they would never dare to do themselves, and there were plenty of them that morning. When he rapped the rail, a few people laughed. When he did his asterisk look at me asterisk routine, a boy near the front cheered him on. Phones swung toward him. He fed on it. He grew, the way that kind of man grows, on the attention. Every laugh a log on his fire, and his voice climbed, and his gestures got wider, and the coaxing turned to mockery, and the mockery turned, by slow, ugly degrees, to something with an edge on it. "Toy soldier," he called up at Sergeant Vane, tipping his head back to do it. "Hey, toy soldier, does it talk? Say something." "No, nothing." He turned in a slow circle with his arms spread, playing to the phones. "They just sit there, they can't do anything. They're not allowed to do anything. It's the softest job in the world. You sit on a horse, you do nothing, you get a costume." He spread his hands wider, grinning. "I could do it. Anyone could do it. Watch, watch, I'll show you how hard it is." I should say a word here about his companions, because they were a part of what was wrong, and because their part in it is a thing I have come to understand better with the years. The younger man and the woman were not cruel people, I think. I watched them, and what I saw in their faces was not the loud man's hunger, but something closer to a slow, sinking dread, the look of people who have been swept along in another person's momentum for so long that they have forgotten they are allowed to plant their feet. Every loud man travels with a court like that. It is how he becomes loud in the first place. He surrounds himself with people who have learned over years that objecting costs more than enduring, and so they endure. And their enduring is read by everyone, including him, as approval, and the approval feeds him, and he grows. I have thought since that if either of them had simply taken his arm at the start and said, plainly, "That's enough now. We're leaving," the whole morning might never have happened. But they did not, because they had long ago been trained out of it, and so they trailed after him into the square the way they had trailed after him into 100 other rooms, filming what they were told to film and hating it and saying nothing. There is a kind of silence that is discipline, which the guard was keeping. And there is a kind of silence that is cowardice dressed as peace, which they were keeping. The morning would, before it was over, make the difference between the two plain to everyone watching. "Are you filming?" the loud man demanded of the younger one again, and the younger one nodded miserably and held his phone a little higher, and the loud man turned back to his performance, refreshed by the camera the way an actor is refreshed by a full house. He had an audience now, 2 audiences, the phone and the crowd, and a man like that will do for an audience what he would never do alone. Half the ugliness of the world is committed for a camera by men who, in an empty room, would simply have gone home. I am convinced of it. I have watched too many quiet fools become loud ones the instant a lens turned their way to believe otherwise. Now, if it had stopped at mockery, this would be no story at all. Men mock the guard every day. It rolls off them like rain off wax. It is beneath their notice and it is beneath the telling. I have seen 100 loud fools stand at that rail and jeer and grow bored and wander off, and the guard sat through all of them and never so much as blinked, and the fools never understood that the not blinking was not weakness but a strength so total it did not need to spend itself on them. But the tall man could not leave it at mockery, because mockery had not gotten him what he wanted. He wanted a reaction. He was starving for one. And so he did the thing that turned a nuisance into an incident, the thing that made the whole square go still, the thing I have replayed in my mind 100 times since. He decided to startle the horse. I saw him bend and pick something up off the ground, a crumpled paper bag, I think, or the wrapper from something, a light bit of rubbish blown up against the base of the railing. He balled it in his fist. He glanced at the phone to be sure it was on him. And then, with a whoop and a lunge, he threw both arms up over the railing straight at Bramble's head and flung the paper and shouted, a short, violent, explosive shout, the kind of noise meant to make a creature jump out of its skin, right into the mare's face. The crowd flinched, I flinched. Somewhere a woman gasped, a short high sound, and the boy who had cheered went silent. Because for one heartbeat, the whole square understood the thing the tall man had not troubled to understand, that a half-ton animal, startled, in a crowd pressed up against a railing, with children and elderly people packed shoulder to shoulder along the barrier, is not a joke. A horse that spooks and rears and bolts in a space like that is a catastrophe waiting for a reason, and the tall man in his linen jacket had just, for the sake of 9 seconds of video, handed it one. I have thought a great deal in the time since about the fraction of a second that came next. It was the hinge of the whole thing, and it was so small that most of the phones missed it entirely. Bramble did not spook. The paper bounced off the noseband of her bridle and fluttered down between the railings and lay there. The shout rang off the palace stone and died, and the great gray mare stood exactly, precisely, immovably where she had stood, her dark eye level, her ears forward, one hind hoof cocked lazily to rest, as though a man had not just flung rubbish and violence into her face, as though nothing at all had happened, because to her, trained through years to exactly this, nothing had. She did not flinch. She did not shy. She did not so much as shift her weight. 9 years of standing that corner while the world did its worst had made her, in that instant, more disciplined than the man, more dignified than the man, more of a person than the man, and every soul in that forecourt saw it at once. And on her back, Sergeant Vane had not moved either, except that his gloved hand, the right one, had come off the rein and rested now lightly on the mare's gray neck, a small steadying touch, a thing between the two of them that had nothing to do with the crowd. It was the only motion he made. It said everything. The tall man, though, was not watching the horse. He was watching his own performance, and when the horse did not react, when his big violent effort produced nothing again, nothing, the same serene nothing as before, only now with a whole square staring at him, the small hot thing in him boiled over. He had made a fool of himself in front of an audience he had been trying to impress, and there is no creature on earth more dangerous, in a small way, than a vain man who has just felt foolish. So he grabbed the railing with both hands, set his foot on the low rail, and began to climb over it, onto the raked gravel, toward the horse. "Fine," he was saying, and his voice had gone ugly and thick now, the playfulness burned off it. "Fine, you want to ignore me. Let's see you ignore me up close. Let's see this thing actually." He got one leg over the top rail. And that at last was when Sergeant Vane moved. It was not the move the tall man expected. It was not the move any of us expected, if I am honest, because we had all been braced for the crash, the horse to bolt, the man to be flung, the whole ugly domino of it. But the sergeant did none of the dramatic things. He turned his head. That was all at first. He turned his helmeted head and looked down at the man scrambling over the rail, and he said, in a voice that was not loud but that carried across that whole hushed square the way a struck bell carries, 4 words. "Sir, get back now." I have tried since to describe that voice to people who were not there, and I have never gotten it right. It was not a shout. A shout would have been weaker. It was low and flat and absolutely level. A voice with no anger in it and no fear in it and no doubt in it at all. The voice of a man who has given hard orders in hard places and been obeyed, and who expects, as a simple matter of physics, to be obeyed now. It was the voice of authority stripped of everything but its bone, and it hit the tall man like a hand on the chest. He froze. One leg over the rail, one foot still on the gravel, he froze, and for a single clean second the vanity went out of his face and something honest came into it, and the honest thing was that he was afraid. Not of being hurt. He was in no danger of being hurt, and on some level he knew it. He was afraid the way a boy is afraid when a schoolmaster's voice finds him across a room, the deep old animal fear of having crossed a line drawn by someone with the right to draw it. For that 1 second, the tall man in the expensive jacket was simply a person who had been caught doing something he should not do, and he knew it, and it showed. If he had climbed back over the rail then, muttering, red-faced, and slunk off into the crowd, I would have forgotten him by lunch. That is how most of these end. The voice does its work, the fool retreats, the guard faces front, the square breathes again. It is a small daily drama and it resolves itself small. But the tall man's companions were still filming. And the crowd, which a moment ago had turned against him, I had felt it turn, that cold ripple of collective disapproval that runs through a group of strangers when one of them goes too far. The crowd was watching to see what he would do. And a man like that, a man whose whole life is built on never being the one who backs down, cannot back down in front of an audience. He would rather be wrong loudly than right quietly. And so, having felt fear and hating the feeling, he did what that kind of man always does with fear. He converted it into outrage. "Did you?" He pulled his leg back over the rail, yes, but not in retreat. He planted himself on the public side of it and jabbed a finger up at the sergeant, and his voice climbed to a shout, a real one now, raw and carrying. "Did you just give me an asterisk order, did you? You don't order me. You don't. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have the first idea?" He did not, it turned out, actually tell us who he was, then or ever, which was itself instructive. The men who truly matter almost never have to ask whether you know who they are. It is only the ones who suspect, deep down, that the answer is nobody in particular who wield the question like a weapon. "I am a asterisk guest in this country," he shouted, and he had found his register now, the aggrieved important register, and he was going to ride it. "A guest. I pay to be here. My money, do you understand? People like me are why this whole rotten little pageant exists. The tourists, us. We pay for the costume you're wearing, we pay for the hay that thing eats, and you sit up there and you order asterisk me around like I'm." He turned to the crowd, arms wide, appealing. "You all saw that. You saw it. He threatened me. A public servant threatening a paying visitor over a asterisk horse." Nobody in the crowd said a word. I want you to sit with that because I did, standing there behind my cold chestnuts. Nobody said a word. A moment before, some of them had laughed with him. Now, when he turned to them for support, when he spread his arms and asked them to be on his side, they gave him nothing. Not a laugh, not a nod, not a single voice raised in his defense. They stood in that bright, cold morning and they looked at him. This loud, handsome, well-dressed man who had thrown rubbish in a horse's face and then tried to climb a barrier, and their faces were closed to him. The tide had gone all the way out, and I think, somewhere under the outrage, he felt it, and it frightened him more than the sergeant's voice had, because outrage he could perform his way out of, but a silent crowd offers nothing to push against. Sergeant Vane, meanwhile, had faced front again. Having said his 4 words and been obeyed in the only way that mattered, the man was back on the public side of the rail. He had turned his eyes forward and gone still, and Bramble had gone still under him, and the two of them were once more the monument they had been before, as though the shouting man did not exist. This is the discipline the public never quite believes is real until they see it. Not that the guard does not react, but that the guard genuinely, wholly, will not be drawn. The sergeant had drawn the line, sir, get back, and the man had crossed back over it, and that closed the matter as far as the sergeant's duty went. He was not going to argue. He was not going to explain. He was not going to give the shouting man the fight the shouting man so badly craved. He simply resumed his post, and his silence, which the man had read all morning as weakness, now stood revealed as the strongest thing in the square. But the man could not stop. He was in too deep now. He had made a public production of himself. He had been rebuffed. The crowd had gone cold, and every one of those things made the small hot thing in him burn hotter. He paced along the rail, back and forth, hurling words up at the motionless sergeant, and they got worse, because a man with no answer only gets louder. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Look at me. No, still nothing. What are you, deaf? Are you actually deaf up there? He laughed, a horrible, strained laugh with no joy in it. This is a scam. This whole thing is a scam for tourists. You're not real soldiers, you're actors. You're hey, hey. He slapped the rail again, that hard metal clang. I'll make you move. I swear I'll make you move if it's the last thing I... And here I must be careful, because here the video clips and the truth part weighs for good, and I am one of the few who saw the truth. The tall man reached out fast, a sudden jab of the arm, and he swatted at the mare's muzzle. Not a heavy blow. I want to be fair even to him. It was not a punch, it was a swat, an open-handed slap at her nose, contemptuous and provoking, the kind of thing you might do to knock a fly off a table. But he did it to a horse's face in a crowd on purpose to make her jump. And this time there was no paper between his hand and the animal. This time he touched her. I heard the crowd's breath go in all at once, a single sharp inhale from 100 throats. I heard a child somewhere begin to cry, frightened by the sudden violence of the motion without understanding it. And I felt my own stomach drop because I have seen horses swatted, and I know what most of them do, and what most of them do is not stand there. Bramble stood there. She stood there. His hand met the soft gray of her muzzle, and she took it the way she took the wind and the flags and the brass band and the 9 years of strangers, which is to say she did not take it at all. She simply remained, unmoved, unbroken, her dark eye level and her ears forward, and the only thing in all the world that changed was that Sergeant Vane's gloved right hand came off the rein again and settled on her neck, and stayed there, and his jaw, under the strap of his helmet, had set into a hard flat line. He did not look down at the man this time. He did not need to, because the swat at the horse had changed the nature of the thing entirely, and everyone in that square who knew anything at all understood it in the same instant. Mockery is nothing. Shouting is nothing. But a man had now laid his hand, in anger, on a household horse of the crown, on ceremonial duty before a crowd. That is not rudeness. That is an assault. And it is an assault that the law of that kingdom takes with deadly seriousness, for reasons of dignity and reasons of public safety both. Because the man who will strike a guard's horse for a video is the man who, given a worse day and a worse impulse, will do something a great deal more dangerous, and a kingdom that lets the first go learns to regret it when the second comes. And so quietly, without fuss, at the edges of my vision, things began to move. You would not have caught it if you did not know to look. The crowd did not catch it. They were all fixed on the loud drama at the rail. But I have watched that gate for 31 years, and I know its machinery the way a sailor knows the set of a familiar sea, and I saw the small currents begin to run. At the gatehouse, 40 feet along the railing, a foot guard who had been standing sentry stepped back into the shadow of the arch and spoke into his collar. I could not hear him, but I saw his lips move and I saw his eyes, which did not leave the tall man for a second. Down the line of mounted escort, the two nearest riders, I did not know their names, but I knew their posts had shifted. Not much, just a fractional turning of the head, a settling of the reins, the readiness of men who have been told in the quietest possible way that something at the corner post may require them. And above, at a first-floor window of the gatehouse that I had never once in 31 years seen occupied, a face appeared behind the glass, an older man in a dark uniform with silver at the collar, and he stood there and watched the square with the flat attention of a man reading a page he intends to act on. None of it was hurried. That is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that made it so much more frightening than any commotion would have been. There was no shout of alarm, no whistle, no rush of running boots. There was only this slow, silent, terrible competence gathering itself at the edges of the scene like weather building on a horizon, while the tall man, who could see none of it, went on shouting at a horse that would not look at him, absolutely certain that he was the most important thing in the square. He was, by now, well past the point where a sensible man would have stopped. The swat at the mare's muzzle had gotten him no reaction, and the lack of reaction had made him wilder, and he was working himself into a genuine fury, pacing the rail, spitting words. I will not repeat all of them. Some of them were the ordinary ugly things, the toy soldier things, the scam things, the who do you think you are things. But some of them had curdled into something worse, a nastier register, threats now, real ones. I'll have your job and I'll own this square by the time my lawyers are done, and you'll be cleaning that horse's stall in a week, both of you, and he was jabbing his finger up at the motionless sergeant with everyone, and flecks of spit caught the cold light. And through all of it, I cannot say this enough, because it was the marrow of the whole thing through all of it, Sergeant Haldon Vane did not move, and Bramble did not move, and the two of them sat that corner post in perfect stillness while the storm broke over them, and the stillness was not empty. That is what the loud man never understood and never would. He thought the stillness was nothing, was absence, was the blank of a statue, but I could see the sergeant's face, and there was nothing blank in it. There was a whole ocean held behind a dam. There was the enormous, deliberate, moment-by-moment work of a disciplined man choosing, again and again, second after second, not to answer, not to strike, not to give this creature the reaction he was clawing for, choosing it not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to hold a thing that most men could not have held for 10 seconds. The stillness was the loudest statement in the square. It said, "You cannot touch me. You cannot touch her. There is nothing you can do, nothing you can say, nothing you can throw that will move us 1 inch, because we are not here for you. We are here for something you are too small to see." Let me tell you about Haldon Vane and his gray mare, because I learned most of it afterward, and because you cannot understand the stillness unless you understand what was inside it. The sergeant had not always sat a gate. Before the household escort, this came out later in the papers, though he never spoke of it himself, then or ever. He had served 20 years in the hard places, in the mounted patrols that go where the roads end and the peace is thin, the long, cold border postings where a man learns that composure is not a manner but a survival trait, where panic gets people killed, and the ones who live are the ones who can stand still inside chaos and think. He had brought men home across bad ground more than once by being the calm at the center when everyone around him was coming apart. He wore, on quiet mornings, a small ribbon on his tunic that most of the tourists never noticed and never asked about, and the ribbon was not given for pageantry. When they made him a sergeant of the household escort, it was not a soft retirement, whatever the loud man screamed. It was an honor. They put the steadiest man they had at the most public post in the kingdom, at the corner where the whole world came to test whether the crown's discipline was real, precisely because they knew he would never, ever break. And Bramble had been his the whole 9 years. He had trained her from a green 4-year-old, hours and hours in the yard behind the barracks, teaching her the flags and the drums and the umbrellas and the sudden noises, teaching her that the world could throw anything at her and she was safe, because he was there, because his hand would come to her neck and his weight would sit easy in the saddle and nothing would be allowed to hurt her. That is what those years buy. That is what the loud man swat met when it struck her muzzle, not a stupid dumb beast but 9 years of patient love disguised as discipline, a bond so deep that when the crisis came the horse looked to the man, and the man's hand came to the horse, and the two of them together simply held, the way they had held 1,000 times in the quiet dark of the training yard where no cameras ever went. I did not know all of that standing there, but I knew the shape of it, the way you know a person is strong before you know why. And I knew, we all knew, the whole silent crowd knew, that we were watching something rare. We were watching a man be provoked past the point where any of us could have held and hold. It is a strange thing to be moved to the edge of tears by a man doing nothing. But that is what a great many of us were, standing in that cold square. There is a kind of nothing that is the most that a person can do. Something else was happening in the crowd now, too, and I want to set it down, because it was the part that stopped the affair from being merely a spectacle and made it, briefly, dangerous, and because it is where a second sort of person entered the square. There is always, in a crowd of that size, a scattering of the tall man's own kind, not friends of his, but fellow travelers in temperament, men and 1 or 2 women who move through the world the same way he did, who are used to being obeyed, who read another person's rudeness as permission for their own. And for a few ugly minutes, as the loud man ranted and the crowd went cold against him, I watched 2 or 3 of these begin, tentatively, to test whether the cold was really there. A heavy-set man in a bright jacket, near the middle of the rail, called out something in support. He's got a point. They're not allowed to touch you. You can do what you like, and laughed and looked around for company. A younger fellow near him took out a phone and began, deliberately, to imitate the loud man, rapping on the rail himself, waving his own hand at the next horse down the line, trying to catch a little of the same wicked electricity. For a moment I felt the whole mood of the square teeter, the way a crowd will, on the edge of turning from 100 separate disapprovals into one shared cruelty. Because cruelty, too, is contagious, and a mob is only a crowd that has decided its worst member is its truest one. And here is a thing I have thought about a great deal since. The guard did not stop that. The guard could not stop that, could not lecture the crowd, could not shame the hecklers, could not do any of the loud, satisfying things a lesser man in a lesser role might have reached for. All he could do was hold his post and be still. And yet the stillness did stop it. That is the mystery I keep circling. Because as the heavyset man laughed and the younger one aped the ranting and the mood teetered, people's eyes kept going back helplessly, the way your eyes go to the one steady thing in a rocking boat, to the motionless figure at the corner, to Sergeant Vane, sitting his gray mare with his gauntlets quiet on the reins and his eyes forward, taking all of it, giving back none of it. And against that stillness, the imitators looked suddenly small. The heckling did not catch. The heavy-set man's laugh trailed off into an embarrassed silence when nobody joined it. The younger fellow lowered his phone and stopped his aping and drifted a step back into the crowd, because it is one thing to jeer along with a bold ringleader, and quite another to keep jeering when the crowd around you has gone quiet, and the only dignified man in sight is the one you are jeering at. The stillness had shamed them without a word. It had held up a mirror, and they had not liked what stood in it. I do not think the loud man ever grasped that this was happening, that even as he raged, the crowd was quietly deciding, by the simple magnetism of the guard's composure, which kind of person it wished to be. But I watched it happen, and it taught me something about the real work of a figure like that. We think the mounted guard is decoration. We think he stands there to be photographed, a bit of gilded theater for the tourists. But that morning I understood that he does something else, something that has no name and gets no thanks. He sets the temperature of the square. A crowd around a still, disciplined, dignified man behaves, over time, a little more like him. A crowd around chaos behaves like chaos. Every hour that Sergeant Vane sat that corner in silence, he was, without moving a muscle, quietly holding 1,000 strangers a half-degree closer to their better selves, and never once knew he was doing it, and would have been baffled to be told. Let me tell you, too, what it costs. Because the loud man screamed all morning that the guard's job was the softest in the world, that he sat and did nothing and got a costume for it. And there is a version of that which fools believe and a truth underneath it which they never see. I have talked, over 31 years, with enough guardsmen across enough cold mornings to know a little of what stillness costs. It is not nothing to stand for hours in the cold with your face composed, while a man calls you an actor and a coward and worse. It is not nothing to feel a stranger's spit-flecked contempt an arm's length from your face, and to hold your eyes forward and your hands quiet when everything in your body, every old animal instinct a man is born with, is screaming at you to answer, to defend, to strike, to simply turn your head. The discipline is not the absence of that impulse. That is what people misunderstand. The discipline is feeling all of it, the full hot rush of it, and choosing, second after grinding second, not to spend it. A statue feels nothing, and so its stillness is free. A man feels everything, and so his stillness is bought, moment by moment, at a price, and paid again, for as long as the post requires. That morning it was required for the better part of a quarter of an hour, under provocation that would have snapped most men in 90 seconds, and Sergeant Vane paid it the whole way through, and the paying did not show, and the not showing was the most expensive part of all. I could see if I looked closely, and I did look closely, the small tolls it took, a muscle working at the hinge of his jaw, the gauntleted hands a fraction stiller than still, the stillness of held effort rather than ease. Once, only once, a slow breath drawn and let go, the breath of a man mastering himself. That was the whole visible cost of holding against a storm that would have wrecked most of us, and if you did not know to look for it, you would have seen a placid man on a placid horse having, apparently, an unremarkable morning. The ease was the achievement. The ease was the lie the discipline told, and told well, so that the loud man's poison would find nowhere to land. The tall man's companions had stopped filming. I noticed it, and it told me the tide had turned even among his own. The younger man had lowered his phone and was standing with it dark at his side, his face gone pale and unhappy, glancing between the loud man and the crowd, and the slow, silent gathering at the gatehouse that he, too, had perhaps begun to sense. The woman had stepped back several paces, physically separating herself from the scene, her arms wrapped around her middle, and she was saying something now, urgently, low, we have to go now, please, this is finished, and the loud man, who had shrugged her off a dozen times, this time turned on her. Don't you tell me to go, he snarled. Don't you dare, I'm not finished. I'm not going anywhere until this asterisk actor, until somebody up there acknowledges that I exist, that I'm a person, that I, and his voice cracked, actually cracked, and I understood then with a clarity that has stayed with me, what was really the matter with him. Under all the money and the linen and the noise, he was a man who did not, in some fundamental way, believe that he existed unless he was being looked at. And he had come, in his careless roaming, upon the two beings in all that crowded square who would not look at him, who could not be made to look at him, and it was killing him. It was a kind of death to him. The horse's serene indifference and the soldier's iron silence were, to a man built the way he was built, unbearable, and he would rather burn the whole morning down than endure them. And I want to pause on the mare here, on Bramble, because in all the tellings of that morning she is the one who gets the least of the credit and deserves the most. We speak of the guard's discipline as though it were his alone, but a mounted guard is two disciplines, not one, and the harder half of it that morning was hers. Consider what was actually being asked of her. A horse is a prey animal. 10,000 years of the wild are wired into the deepest part of it, and every one of those years says the same thing. When a large, fast thing lunges at your face and shouts, you run. You do not think. You do not weigh it, you turn and you run, because the ones who ran are the ones who lived to become the ancestors of every horse now living. That instinct does not go away with training. It cannot. It sits in the animal always, a coiled spring, and all the training in the world does is teach the horse to hold a hand against the spring, to look in the half-second of terror to the rider on its back, and take its cue from him, rather than from 10,000 years of ancestors screaming *run. That is what Bramble did, over and over all through that morning. When the loud man flung the paper and shouted, the spring in her fired, I have no doubt it fired, that every instinct in her body lit up at once and said bolt *. And in that half-second she did the thing that only years of trust can buy. She looked to the man on her back, and felt his weight sit easy and his hand come light to her neck, and she chose him over her ancestors. She chose the quiet certainty of you are safe. I am here over the oldest fear a living thing can hold. And she did it again when the man swatted her muzzle, and she would do it again in a moment, under a far worse provocation than either. Every second she stood there was a small act of courage, the courage of an animal mastering its own deepest nature out of love for one man, and the loud man, who thought her a dumb, unfeeling statue, never understood that he was not defeating a dull machine, but being defeated by a brave and frightened creature who was choosing, breath by breath, not to run from him. There is no braver thing on four legs than a horse that stands its ground against its own blood, and Bramble was standing hers. So he reached for the thing that would force a response. He reached for the horse's bridle. He lunged at the rail, both hands out, and got a fist around the mare's cheekpiece, around the leather of the bridle by her jaw, and he yanked hard, a real wrench, meant to drag her head down and around, meant to make her stumble, meant to make her move, and the crowd screamed. A short ragged burst of 100 voices, and the child who had been crying wailed, and for one horrible instant the whole thing hung on the edge of the catastrophe we had all been dreading. A half-ton animal wrenched off balance at a crowded rail. And Bramble planted. I will remember it until I die. He hauled on the bridle with the whole weight of a grown man, and the great gray mare simply set her feet and dropped her weight into the ground and became, for that instant, immovable, a thing rooted to the earth, and his wrench did not budge her an inch. Her neck went hard as oak. Her dark eye rolled once toward the man and then leveled again. She did not rear, she did not shy, she did not so much as take a step. 9 years of training and a rider's steadying hand on her neck held her rooted while a furious stranger threw his whole strength against her, and she outstilled him, outdisciplined him, outdignified him, and defeated him utterly by the simple refusal to be moved. That was the moment the last of the crowd came fully over. I felt it go through them like a current. Whatever sneaking half-sympathy the loud man might have salvaged, whatever well he has a point about the tourists paying muttering might have been left, it died the instant he laid 2 hands on that horse and hauled. You do not do that. Every person in that square, from whatever country, knew in their bones that you do not do that. And the crowd's silence, which had been the silence of disapproval, became now the silence of judgment. 100 people watching a man convict himself, waiting only for the sentence. They did not have long to wait. What happened next happened fast, and it happened smoothly, and it is the part that made the little video clips go silent all across the world, though the clips never showed the half of it. I will give you all of it, in order. the way it unfolded from my place behind the chestnut stall. When the loud man wrenched the bridle, Sergeant Vane did move, at last fully, and it was nothing like what the man had spent all morning trying to provoke. There was no anger in it and no violence in it. It was economical and exact, the movement of a man who has done a hard thing many times and does it now without a wasted motion. His gloved hand tightened on the rein and gave Bramble the smallest signal, a thing between the two of them and the mare, who had planted like a rock against the man's wrench, took one single, deliberate, sideways step, away from the rail, out of the man's reach, and his fist was torn from the bridle by the sheer unhurried certainty of the movement. The sergeant had not fought him. He had simply removed the horse from the equation, the way you would lift a cup out of a clumsy child's grasp, and the loud man was left grabbing at empty air with the whole crowd watching him grab at it. And in that same instant, this was the beautiful part, the part that took my breath, the two nearest mounted escort came off their posts. They did not gallop. There was no drama in it. They walked their horses, two big dark bays, out from the line in a slow, inexorable, perfectly controlled arc, and they came around behind the loud man on the public side of the rail, one to each side, and they simply were there suddenly, two mounted soldiers of the household escort flanking a man who a moment ago had felt himself the master of the square. The horse's great shoulders hemmed him without touching him. He turned one way and there was a horse and a silent rider looking down at him. He turned the other way and there was the same. He had wanted to be the center of attention, and now he was, and it was nothing at all like what he had wanted. At the same time, the foot guards moved in from the gatehouse. 3 of them, at a measured march, boots striking the stone in unison. That sound that everyone in the kingdom knows, and that means the matter has stopped being a nuisance and become a proceeding. And behind them, unhurried, came the older man I had seen at the window, the one with silver at his collar, and I understood now that he was the officer of the watch, and that the whole quiet gathering of the last several minutes had been him, assembling the response with the patience of a man who has learned that the surest way to handle a fool is slowly, correctly, and with no gap anywhere for the fool to slip through. The loud man's fury broke apart into something else when he saw them all around him. It was, I think, the first moment in the whole affair that the situation became more real to him than his own performance. He had been playing a scene in which he was the wronged and important man, and the scene had quietly ended without his noticing, and he looked up to find himself simply a person who had assaulted a crown horse in front of 100 witnesses and a wall of cameras, hemmed by mounted soldiers, with the officer of the watch walking toward him across the raked gravel. The linen jacket did not help him now. The money did not help him. The "do you know who I am" did not help him, because the answer at last had arrived, and the answer was, it does not matter who you are. The law here is the same for the guest as for the citizen, and you have broken it, and everyone saw. "Now wait," he said, and his voice had changed completely, the outrage draining out of it, a wheedling note coming in. "Now wait a moment, there's been a misunderstanding. It's a horse. For God's sake, I was playing. You can't seriously." The officer of the watch stopped a pace in front of him. He was an unremarkable-looking man, graying, medium height, with a face like a closed door, and when he spoke it was quietly, so that the crowd had to strain, and the straining made a great hush fall over everything. "Sir," he said, "you put your hands on a horse of the household on ceremonial duty in a public place before this crowd. You attempted to enter a restricted area. You have been recorded doing both." He let that sit for a moment. "You will come with these men now, and you will answer for it. Whether you answer for it as a foolish man who lost his temper or as something worse depends entirely on how you conduct yourself in the next several minutes. I would advise you to be silent and to be still." A pause. "You will find the second one harder than you think. This man," and here the officer's eyes went briefly to Sergeant Vane, still mounted, still facing front, still and silent at his post as though none of this concerned him, has been still all morning under everything you could throw at him. Try to manage it for 5 minutes. I do not think the loud man understood, even then, that he had just been paid the cruelest and truest compliment of the whole morning, and that it had been paid at his expense. But the crowd understood. A low sound went through them, not quite a laugh, warmer and graver than a laugh, a sound of recognition, of a thing named that everyone had felt. They took him then. There was no roughness in it, which somehow made it more final than roughness would have been. 2 of the foot guards fell in on either side of him, and the mounted pair drew back to let them pass, and the officer gestured, and the loud man, deflated now, gone gray in the face, all the bluster leaked out of him, was walked away across the forecourt toward the gatehouse and whatever waited beyond it. His companions trailed after, the woman with her face in her hands, the younger man carrying his dark phone like a thing he wished he had never held. And as they went, the younger man did a curious thing. He stopped and he turned back toward Sergeant Vane, and he stood a moment, and then he lifted his free hand and touched it to his brow in an awkward, unpracticed, wholly sincere salute, an apology in the only language he could find, before he hurried on after the others. The sergeant did not acknowledge it. The sergeant faced front, but I saw the younger man do it, and I have always been glad he did. And then they were gone through the arch, and the square was left with the crowd, and the horses, and the cold, bright morning, and the 2 immovable figures at the corner post, and a silence so complete that I could hear the flags snapping on the palace roof and the far-off sound of the river. That is where the video clips end. The man is led away, the crowd is silent, the horse and the guard stand unmoved. Seconds later, everyone fell silent. That is the line that traveled around the world, and it is true they did. But it is not the end of the story. The clip ends at the silence because the clip is only 9 seconds long, and because the phone that shot it was already lowering. The silence was not the end. The silence was the hinge. What happened in the silence, and after it, is the part I most want you to have, because it is the part that has stayed with me, and it is the part that says what the whole morning meant. Because here is the thing. In the hush after the loud man was led away, the crowd did not disperse. You would expect it to. The show was over. The villain was gone. There was nothing left to film. And yet the 100-odd people at that rail did not drift off to the next attraction the way tourist crowds always do. They stayed. They stood in the cold and they looked at Sergeant Halden Vane on his gray mare, and something was working in them, some feeling that had been building all through the ugly little drama and now had nowhere to go, and it needed, the way such feelings do, to find a shape. It found its shape in the oldest way there is. Somewhere near the front, a single person began, quietly, to applaud. Just one pair of hands at first, a little hesitant, as though the person was not sure it was allowed. Then another joined it, and another, and then the whole rail of them, the whole 100 strangers from wherever they had come, were clapping, not the loud whooping of a crowd at a spectacle, but a steady, warm, deliberate applause, the kind you give not to a performance but to a person, the kind that means thank you and we saw asterisk and well done. It rolled along the railing and it swelled, and it went on far longer than applause usually goes on, because it was not really about the last few minutes at all. It was about something older and larger that the last few minutes had let them feel. It was the sound of a crowd that had come to gawk at a costume and had been shown, instead, a man. And Sergeant Vane did not acknowledge that either. He faced front, and Bramble stood, and the 2 of them received the applause of 100 strangers exactly as they had received the abuse of one, without a flicker, without a nod, without the smallest crack in the discipline that was the whole point of them. Because the discipline does not bend for cruelty, and it does not bend for praise. That is what makes it discipline, and not merely manners. He would no more have grinned and waved at the clapping crowd than he would have shouted back at the loud man. He simply sat his post, and let the applause break over him like the abuse had broken over him, and held. but I was close enough to see his face, and I will tell you what I saw, because it was small and it was real and no camera caught it. As the applause rose, the hard flat line of his jaw eased just slightly, just for a moment, and his gloved hand came off the rein one more time and rested on Bramble's gray neck, and gave it one slow stroke, a private thing, a thing that had nothing to do with the crowd, a man quietly thanking the horse he had trained for 9 years, the horse who had stood with him through the whole of it and never put a foot wrong. "Good girl," the hand said as plainly as words. "Good girl." We held. And the mare flicked one ear back toward him and cocked a hind hoof to rest, and that was all. That was the whole of the tenderness, and it was over in 2 seconds, and then he was a monument again. But I saw it, and of everything I saw that morning, it is the thing I have carried longest. Now I could end the story there, and it would be a good story, and many of the people who told it afterward did end it there. But I promised you the whole of it, and the whole of it has one more turn, and the turn matters, because it is where the kingdom itself weighed in, and where the loud man learned the last and hardest of the morning's lessons. He did not, you see, go quietly, even after they took him through the arch. Men like that rarely do. Within the hour I heard this later from a foot guard who bought his chestnuts from me for years afterward and told me the parts I had not seen. The loud man had recovered enough of his nerve to make threats again, only now they were the specific threats of a man with resources. He would call his embassy. He would call his lawyers. He would ruin the guard, ruin the officer, ruin the whole gilded farce of it. He had money, he had connections, he had, he said, friends who would make one phone call and have this whole ridiculous business made to disappear, and the guard along with it. He said it in the gatehouse, and he said it louder when they moved him on to the station, and he was still saying it, apparently, when the response came. And the response, when it came, was the last thing in the world he expected, and it is the true payoff of this whole tale. Because the embassy did make its call, but it did not make the call the loud man imagined. I do not know exactly how it went in the rooms where such things are decided, but this much came out, and this much is true. When the loud man's embassy was contacted, and it was contacted quickly, because the kingdom is scrupulous about the rights of foreign guests and does everything by the book, the officials on the other end did not do what he had promised the crowd they would do. They did not swoop in to rescue their aggrieved citizen from the petty tyranny of a horse guard. They watched the video. Everyone watched the video. By then it was everywhere. And what the video showed was a well-dressed man of their own nation throwing rubbish in a horse's face, mocking a soldier at his post, climbing a public barrier, striking an animal, and finally seizing a crown horse's bridle and hauling on it in a crowd packed with families and elderly people, and at least one frightened, crying child. The video showed all of that with perfect clarity, and it showed something else too, something the loud man had never once considered while he performed for the cameras. It showed his face. An embassy exists to protect its citizens, but it also exists to protect the standing of the nation those citizens come from, and there is a limit. There has always been a limit to how far a nation will spend its dignity defending a man who has publicly disgraced it in front of the world. The loud man had imagined that his nationality was a shield. He had said as much all morning. "I'm a guest here, I pay to be here, people like me." He had believed, right down to the root of him, that being a foreigner of means placed him above the small local rules that bound the little people of the kingdom he was visiting. And the great irony, the thing that must have landed on him like cold water when it finally came, was that his own embassy agreed that his nationality mattered, and concluded, for exactly that reason, that he must be seen to answer for what he had done, precisely so that his conduct would not be mistaken for the character of his countrymen. So the call that came was not the call he had promised. The embassy issued a short, cool, public statement. It expressed its regret. It noted that the behavior in the video did not reflect the values of its people, that the overwhelming majority of visitors treated their hosts and their hosts' traditions with respect, and that the individual concerned would receive no special protection and would answer to the local authorities as any person would. It thanked the guard, by rank and by post though not by name, for his restraint. It thanked, and I promise you this is in the statement, it thanked the horse. That was the response the loud man never expected. He had reached for his embassy the way he had reached all morning, for the thing that would force the world to arrange itself around his importance. And his own embassy had looked at what he had done, and looked at the whole watching world, and quietly stepped aside, and let the consequence fall on him where it belonged. There is no lawyer's call that undoes a thing like that. The people he had been so sure would rescue him were, in the end, the ones who made certain he could not escape. He had spent the whole morning demanding to know if anyone had any idea who he was, and the answer the world finally gave him was the worst answer of all, the answer he had been running from his whole life. Yes. Now we do. And we would all of us rather you were no one at all. What became of him precisely, I cannot tell you, and I find I do not much care to. He answered to the local court for what he had done, which by all accounts was handled with the same unhurried correctness as everything else that morning. A fine, I believe, and a formal caution, and an order that he not return to the palace grounds. The punishment fitted carefully to the crime so that no one could ever say the kingdom had been cruel to a foolish foreign guest, which would have been its own kind of loss. And then he went home to wherever home was, a smaller man than he had come, carrying a 9-second video that a great many people in his own country had by then seen, and I imagine, though I do not know, that the video followed him for a good long while, the way such things do, and that for a season at least he was known, everywhere he went, as the man who yelled at the guard's horse. I hope it taught him something. I have lived long enough to know that it usually does not, but I hope. The part of the story I do care about, the part I have told and retold across my chestnut stall to anyone who would stand still long enough to hear it, is what happened at the palace in the days after, because that is where the kingdom showed what it valued. And a kingdom, like a man, is best judged by what it honors when no one has forced its hand. They might have done nothing. That would have been the ordinary course. A guard does his duty. Doing his duty is the whole of the job. There is no medal for standing still, and no one expects one. Sergeant Vane certainly expected nothing. When I saw him next, 3 days later, buying his usual paper cone of chestnuts on his day off, in his plain coat with his collar up against the cold, he was exactly the man he had always been, quiet, courteous, giving nothing away. And when I tried to say something to him about that morning, some clumsy word of admiration, he only looked at me for a moment with those steady eyes and said, "It was a horse that wanted looking after and a fool that wanted managing. That's the post." And he paid for his chestnuts and touched his hat to me and walked off into the crowd. And that was the whole of what Halden Vane ever had to say about the most famous morning of his life. He did not think he had done anything. To his mind, he had simply not done the wrong thing, which to a man like that is not an achievement but a floor, the least you can ask of yourself, the baseline of being a person worth the uniform. But the palace did not let it pass, and I was glad, and I will tell you how they did it, because they did it beautifully in the register that suits such things. The king himself, I will not pretend to know the man, but I know what he did took an interest. It was not a large public ceremony. That would have been the wrong note entirely, would have turned a matter of quiet honor into another kind of spectacle, and the whole meaning of the morning had been the refusal of spectacle. Instead, on a gray afternoon that week, in the courtyard behind the barracks where no tourists ever go, the king came down without much announcement, and the household escort was drawn up, and Sergeant Vane was called forward with Bramble at his shoulder. And there quietly, before his fellow soldiers and no cameras at all, the king thanked him. I was not there, of course, but the foot guard who told me the rest of it was, and he told me that the king's words were short and were not about the loud man at all, that the king did not so much as mention him, would not give him even that much room in the moment, which was its own kind of judgment. The king spoke instead about what it means to hold a post. about the ancient, unglamorous, essential work of being the still thing that a restless world can measure itself against, about how the strength that is never used is the hardest strength of all to keep, and the least thanked, and the most necessary. He said, and this is the line the foot guard remembered and repeated to me, and I have never forgotten, that a kingdom is not held together by the swords its guards carry but by the tempers they keep, that any man can strike, but that it takes a rare and disciplined soul to be struck at, mocked at, hauled at in front of the whole watching world, and to answer with nothing but the quiet certainty of a duty larger than himself. And then the king did a thing I am told is not usually done. He turned from the sergeant, and he laid his own hand on the gray mare's neck, in exactly the place where I had seen the sergeant's gloved hand rest 3 times that morning, and he stood a moment with his palm on the warm gray coat, and he thanked the horse. And Bramble, who had stood through flags and drums and a furious stranger's fists, flicked one ear and stood for the king exactly as she stood for everything, and I am told there was not a dry eye in the courtyard, though every man in it would have gone to the grave denying it. There was a citation in the end, entered into the records of the escort, and a small honor pinned on quietly at a later parade, and the mare was given by order, a lengthened and comfortable retirement to look forward to when her years at the corner post were done, a green paddock and an easy old age earned. Those were the formal things, and they were right and proper, but the thing that mattered most was not on any record. The thing that mattered most was the courtyard, and the king's hand on the horse's neck, and the whole silent escort standing witness, and the quiet word said where no camera could turn it into anything but what it was. Because that is what the loud man never understood, and what the applauding crowd understood without being told, and what I have come to understand across 31 years of watching that gate. The morning was never really about him at all. He thought he was the story. He spent every second of it certain that he was the story, straining and shouting and throwing rubbish and hauling on a bridle to force the world to agree that he was the story. And he was not. He was weather. He was a squall that blew up out of a bright morning and blew itself out against something it could not move, and when it was gone, the thing it had broken against was still standing exactly where it had always stood, unhurt, unchanged, undiminished, and that was the story. The story was the stillness. The story was the man who would not be moved, and the horse who would not be moved, and the 9 quiet years of love and discipline that had made them both immovable, and the fact that when the whole watching world was finally given a choice, in the silence after the noise, between the loud man who demanded to be seen and the quiet man who asked for nothing, the whole world chose the quiet man, and rose, and applauded, and fell silent again out of something close to reverence. I have sold chestnuts on that square for 31 years, and I have watched a great many people come to test the mounted guard at the gate, and I have watched every one of them fail, and I have learned, watching, the 2 things worth knowing that I told you at the start. But that morning taught me a third, and I will give it to you now, and then I will let you go. Here is the third thing. We live in a loud age, and it grows louder, and it teaches us day by day that the way to matter is to make noise, to demand, to provoke, to force the world to look, to be the largest and most insistent thing in any square we walk into. The loud man believed that lesson all the way down to his bones, and it made him, in the end, a small and frightened and friendless creature grabbing at a horse's bridle for the crumb of attention it would not give him. But there was another lesson standing not 10 feet from him the whole time, sitting still and silent on a gray mare in the cold, and it said the opposite, and it was true. It said that the largest thing in any square is not the one who shouts but the one who holds, that dignity is not something you take but something you keep, that there is a strength, the rarest and best kind, that is never spent and never seen and never thanked and simply, quietly, does not break, and that when the noise is all over and blown away, it is that strength, and only that strength, that the world will rise to its feet for and grow quiet before and remember. The loud man is forgotten now. I could not tell you his name if you paid me. I never learned it, and neither did the world. But everyone in that district still knows the name of the gray mare who did not flinch, and the sergeant who sat her, and holds them, quietly, in the particular affection a people keep for the ones who showed them, on an ordinary cold morning, exactly what they most wished to believe was still true, that some things simply hold. Bramble stood her corner post for another 2 years after that, and then she went to her green paddock, and she is there yet, I am told, gray now about the muzzle, cropping the good grass in the sun. Sergeant Vane rides a younger horse at the gate these days, and stands as still as ever, and is provoked, now and again, by some new loud fool who has not learned the lesson and has come to teach it to himself. And every so often, on a cold, bright morning when the season is turning and the square is full and I have set out my chestnuts and the wind comes down off the river with a bite in it, I look up from my stall at the immovable figure at the corner of the rail, and I remember, and I am glad all over again, that I was there, that of all the mornings I might have missed. I did not miss that one. The morning a foreign tourist yelled at the Royal Guard's horse, and the horse did not move. And the man did not win, and seconds later everyone fell silent.